All right, Marcy, it looks like you're the only one here today, but if you are just joining us for the first time and you are watching later on, because we are recording this, thank you for joining us. I'm Devin Slossberg, the instructional coach at Creative Learning Systems, and we have a guest speaker today, and I'll let Phil introduce himself.
Hello, I'm Phil Mayhofer, and I started at Creative Learning Systems just 2 years ago in the same position as Devin, as an instructional coach, and then quickly got my responsibility shifted around, and now I'm the senior SmartLab designer, and so I help our sales team make sure that the SmartLabs that are installed across the country are designed to fit the spaces that are available, and make sure that new kits and equipment are brought on, and work closely with the rest of the academics team to support all of you wonderful facilitators and helping students take ownership of their own learning and all that fun stuff that you do every day.
All right, thanks, Phil. It's going to start us off with some of the objectives that we have for today.
Yeah, so our webinar today is focusing on driving inquiry with essential questions, especially in the SmartLab HQ, and how you can do that, how you can use essential questions to enrich the experience that you might have with your students in summer school in the SmartLab, or other times that the students are in the SmartLab. We're going to start out with different types of essential questions before moving on to general overview of like the characteristics of essential questions and how to identify and even formulate your own essential questions that you can use in your SmartLab and as a collaborative tool between different disciplines. And finally, Devin's going to give us an overview of some resources to help you develop and incorporate those essential questions into the work that you do.
All right. So like Phil has already mentioned, we are going to be talking primarily about essential questions, but also how you can use these in SmartLab HQ and with your summer program. I think overall this experience of revisiting essential questions, at least for me, was very reflective and really helpful, because I think it's important for us to revisit this idea of what are these types of questions, what do they kind of look like? And so if you're not using, these webinars as something you're using for summer school, but maybe you're just using them because you want kind of a chance to remind yourself of some of those big ideas that we go over in SmartLab, something that I would say is really helpful is just really thinking about what are the essential questions that you've currently been asking? Are the questions that you're asking in your units honestly essential? And we'll go over some of the ways that you can kind of figure out what is an essential question, what is not an essential question. But overall, they'll really get students thinking about what's being taught. Just thinking about the different subjects that you may see over summer, like ELA, you're reading a book, they just came to the end of a story. An essential question will get students kind of thinking beyond the story. How does this impact them? Maybe they just learned the moral of a story, and they're kind of thinking about, why do I care about this story, and how is it going to change any ideas that I currently have, and just taking away a lot more than just the content being taught, but it kind of goes beyond that. And that goes into what we're really talking about is just what an essential question is. Like I said, they're the really open-ended, thought-provoking questions that you're asking students, and they're sparking kind of this inquiry that goes beyond just the basic content area that they may be learning. More importantly, there's no right answer, which is really hard for students, because I know myself as a student, I was taught questions have answers. But essential questions don't really have just one, answer to a question, but they help them continue to ponder about something. They may change their answer, revise it, and they have to be really comfortable with that idea that essential questions don't have just that one answer and that they're going to continue to change. Just the types of questions that we ask, and we'll go a little more into detail of, are they really based on these big ideas? Are they based on the process of how I am as a learner? But both those questions should be present in your lessons. And they just focus on the really important parts of the ideas you want kids to walk away with. But if they're really great questions, they kind of move students to ask their own questions, which is something that's very difficult for them to do at the beginning unless we're giving them those right tools that get them there. I think a big misconception that teachers have when it comes to like, what are the questions that I'm thinking of asking? Sometimes we ask guiding questions or a question that hooks the lesson or a question that does have a right or wrong answer. And they're like, so do we not ask those questions? I would say that you do still ask those questions. They're just not considered essential. But there's really room for both of those types of questions, those closed questions that are maybe factual, and then those open-ended essential questions. You're going to see them present in any sort of debate. So I wouldn't say that there's no room for both of those questions. You're just really thinking, is the question essential? Are my students coming back to this answer over and over again? And is it something that can be present in a 3rd grade classroom and then that same question be present in like a 7th grade classroom? Just maybe your answers have changed slightly, as you've gotten to know more resources around the subject. And we'll talk a little bit more about how those would be present in each of these subjects. So these are just some of the examples that I pulled. I think that there's 2 different kind of ideas of these questions. There's this idea that these are topical questions, and then there's also overarching questions. And we're kind of seeing examples of both. And those overarching questions are kind of exactly what it sounds like, overarching, where the topical questions kind of fall under, I think of like a picture of an umbrella. I'm sure you've seen it for like main idea. Like the little raindrops are the topical questions, whereas the overarching question is the actual umbrella. But those topical essential questions are still open-ended. They're still really inspiring students to think higher order. They require a lot of justification. So if I'm having a debate with, a group of students, that every student that gives an answer is able to justify their answer. And as a result, they're also super engaging because they are able to justify their answer. Also, in all of these examples, there's another common trend is that they're really focused on being questions that are metacognitive and reflective. So they're continuously going back to them. They're not something that they can pick up their phone and just ask Siri the answer to the question. Or if you don't have Siri and you're just someone who Googles the answer, these shouldn't be answers that they're able to come to just by asking the internet. They are phrased in a very kid-friendly way. So these are all questions that are very approachable to any student. We think about how do we scaffold learning, or how do we use questions to scaffold learning? Essential questions are already scaffolded because they're very, there's an entry point for every single student in the room. And that's why we really like to use them. It's, if I'm a strong reader or I'm not a strong reader, I still can have an answer to a question that maybe actually my answer is reflecting different than the strongest reader in the room because I think differently, and that's exactly what we want students to do. Also, I've used this, I think, in my math webinar, was the idea that there's low floor, high ceiling, and we really do see that present in these questions as well. As the floor is low enough where everyone can come on, and the ceiling is high enough as the answers can be as complex or as simple as we make them. And so there's multiple entry points. But just to give you an idea of some of those questions, in language arts, what do good readers do, especially when they don't comprehend a text? How does what I am reading influence how I should read it? Why am I writing and for whom? How do effective writers hook and hold their readers? Just some essential questions in science. What makes objects move the way they do? How are structure and function related to living things? Is aging a disease? Why and how do scientific theories change? And then just some for math. When and why should we estimate? Is there a pattern? How does what we measure influence how we measure? And how does how we measure influence what we measure or don't measure? So these are just some examples that I think that kind of speak to what we want students to see in essential questions. All right.
Yeah, and
And
I
now Phil's
think
going to introduce.
perfect. Yeah, thank you, Devin. I think each of those questions that Devin just highlighted are some wonderful examples and share quite a few characteristics. And these are some of the characteristics that some really smart people who wrote a really great book came up with. And so I just wanted to share them with you and highlight them so that as you develop your own or identify essential questions to use in the SmartLab or in other areas that you're teaching, you can use these as kind of a benchmark of whether or not a question is essential. Like Devin has highlighted, essential questions are definitely open-ended and don't have a single final answer most of the time. They're really intended to lead to deeper thought and be intellectually engaging, so that you can have a discussion or debate on it. And part of that open-endedness leads into that, so that it isn't just a, oh, the answer's 54 and Christopher Columbus sailed across the ocean blue in 1492, that kind of stuff. Those factual questions aren't good essential questions because they're not open-ended and they're kind of just, there's the answer and that's it. They also promote higher order thinking so that you can't just calculate the answer and get it. You have to analyze more deeply and infer data that may not be present in the question that's given. It also requires evaluation or prediction based on limited information often. And always leads to important transferable ideas. And I think that's one of the big things about essential questions that makes a lot of sense with SmartLab learning is the concepts of STEM and STEAM and the activities that take place in the SmartLab are all about synthesis and transferring things from different content areas, right? So it's not just going through math exercises or focusing in on a specific scientific concept or a language arts reading, but it's transferring that information, and essential questions should focus on those transferable ideas. They often also raise additional questions to spark that further inquiry. Those additional questions can often be their own standalone essential questions, or they can be more of those topical questions that focus in on just a specific portion of what that discussion is leading to. Devin also highlighted a lot of the previous questions requiring support or justification so that each student is really reflecting on what their answers are or what their thoughts are about that type of question. And so as you work with essential questions, asking follow-up questions can be really valuable as well to guide those students to additional support and reasoning to justify the answers they give. Essential questions, like Devin mentioned, are also revisited over time and can have different results or different responses based on gained experience or on further insight that is gained through discussions or additional research or just thinking through a different lens. And you probably have an awesome book by the authors that are shown on this page in your SmartLab. And a lot of the ideas that we're presenting here are actually from that book. And so if you want to dig in even deeper, you can browse that book. The first few chapters are definitely really helpful in gaining a baseline understanding, and then later chapters can definitely help with further development of your own questions. Next slide, please.
So
this is you. Yeah,
oh,
sorry.
you're good. Unless you want to explain about writing.
No, you got this one.
I think both the process and the product of identifying essential questions is really valuable. And that kind of talks about how we write those good essential questions. Thinking about, essential questions by asking yourself, kind of like Jeopardy, if the content is given to us as the answer, what is the question? So kind of similar to how Jeopardy kind of runs in that way. And since one of our main purposes of essential questions is really to deepen students' understanding of a topic, it can be really helpful to first identify what you want students to answer, what do you want students to understand by the end of the course, and then remember that understanding is deeper than simply, reciting some sort of correct answer. It's really about how am I going to get students to reveal the process that they went through and better understand themselves as a learner. And, when our students understand that topic, they make really strong connections, like we've said, to previous knowledge, and then they transfer that knowledge to, across multiple subjects. The process that we kind of have for identifying essential questions really forces you to identify what matters in your lesson. So a lot of the time, you're looking at your lesson and you're like, wow, I have a 45-minute class period and I have to get this lesson in. If I'm thinking about what are the essential questions, I'm going to start pulling out what's really, really important. Why does it matter? And how am I going to get students to have that discourse or that conversation that leads them to this really strong connection? And then if I'm asking myself, like, why does this content matter? Why am I teaching it to my students? I also have to get my students to answer those questions as well. Who is this information for? And if I'm a student that has zero interest in the topic that I'm teaching, how am I going to pull in, their interests? How am I going to find that common ground so that they can actually create this important life skill of creating their own questions or creating an engaging opportunity for me? And then thinking about, these are just some basic prompts that you can ask yourself when you're creating the questions. It says, what should the student have learned prior to the teaching task? So thinking about what are the kind of prior lessons that you might have taught or the previous grades that would kind of lead up to the essential question that you're asking right now. What will the students need to know in order to answer the question? So am I giving them a bunch of resources or am I giving them access to resources? How are they going to get those resources? If they don't have a computer, are you going to give them books? Whatever it is that you're deciding to do. What strategies will actively engage the student as they work toward the answer? And when I think strategies, I think facilitation strategies. So if I'm thinking about the discourse at the end of the lesson, that's really great and really purposeful, but that's not as engaging towards the beginning. So how am I going to ask that question at the beginning? Then maybe revisit that question during a mini lesson, see how they've changed their answers, give them a chance to debate with each other. You should really be paying attention to, am I doing all the talking or are the students really doing a lot of the talking to each other, asking questions to each other? If you find yourself doing most of the talking, your students are probably not as engaged with the question that you're asking. What formative assessments will inform if the students are learning the information? This is very closely connected to how your school does assessment. So, for me, maybe I would do some sort of think, pair, share. I'm listening into kids, what they're saying to each other. I'm taking a formative assessment. But if you really need something that, an exit ticket, because that's what your school requires, that can be seen as a formative assessment, but more importantly, what are you doing with that assessment? So you're not just picking up the information from students, but you're collecting that information and figuring out, how is this going to direct the next day's lesson or, direct the conversation that I may want students to be having. And then the last question, what skills will the students need in order to demonstrate the response to the question? So it's kind of similar to the resources question, is if they don't have the skills, how am I going to model them for, the rest of the class? If they don't know how to have a conversation in their head about, if I don't understand this reading, what do I do? It's really important to then show them the skill of, do a think aloud and actually have them listen in on the conversation that you're having with yourself, because it's very rare that students understand that in order to understand who we are as learners, we really need to understand how we learn. So for me, I actually do need to speak out loud to better understand, but I didn't know that until a teacher, modeled this for me. And I was like, wow, this was really eye-opening for me. So yeah, these are just some questions. I don't think they're all the questions. I think we do have a resource that we're going to visit at the end that kind of goes over what an essential question is and what it isn't. And I thought that was really helpful because sometimes non-examples are easier to follow than examples when you're writing those questions. All right, Phil, this is you.
Awesome. Perfect. So we've talked about a lot of different types of questions so far, and we've mentioned briefly how essential questions relate to questions that can hook and other types of questions, and another special type of question that can be used to support an essential question are unit questions. And as I was reviewing this slide before the webinar, something that stood out to me is that idea of different facets of an essential question, and unit questions being used to explore different facets of an essential question, because really essential questions can be kind of complex, can have a lot of information packed into them, especially since they are sparking discussion and are requiring deep analysis and thought. And so that visual of a gemstone with multiple facets came to my mind, and unit questions can be a close examination of just a single face of that gemstone. And this is especially helpful when working with a team of teachers to explore some overarching essential questions that show up in a variety of disciplines. And so each member of that team of teachers can use unique unit questions that approach the essential question to show how different connections can be made between the disciplinary ideas. On the next slide, we'll see some examples of that, I believe. Yep, so the overarching essential question that this teacher team is using in our little fictional slide teacher team is, how does conflict produce change? And so through the three different lenses that we see here, language arts, social studies, and science, they're each taking different content areas that they're exploring in their classes, and seeing how those support exploration of the idea of conflict producing change. So in language arts, the unit questions might be, in Lord of the Flies, how do the characters respond to conflict? And that will give a great discussion on the reading that the students are doing to explore examples of responding to conflict. Another question that they could ask is, how does Lord of the Flies help us to understand our complex human nature? And that can lead to discussions about conflict producing change in ourselves, in society, in a range of different areas. Social studies can view that conflict producing change through the different lens of history and war, as well as impacts on economy or society in general. So that center question, how does war create change in the economy? A unit on World War II and rationing might focus on those specific things that happened, and then lead to discussions about conflict producing change. Finally, as science can focus on different biomes and ecosystems and how conflict within those ecosystems can produce change and how sometimes changes can produce conflict as well. And so how do animals adapt to a changing environment can provide an additional set of insights to that overarching essential question of how does conflict produce change. And so, especially in a SmartLab environment, I think this is something that can work out really well as you collaborate with other teachers who are focused on specific disciplines or specific content areas, because you have a unique opportunity of merging some of those ideas and concepts. And so you can use a bunch of different unit questions from your colleagues to support overarching essential questions that you can then revisit across grade levels as well. So math is a great example in how math can be used to understand the world around them. And that within a unit about fractals, you could just ask, what are fractals about? Like those questions, as simple as they are, can then lead to the discussions about the essential question of understanding more in depth the world around us. The next questions that we see there are super powerful when evaluating or analyzing stories and how stories are important throughout time. I think there's a lot of resources out there to explore stories, and of course language arts is all about stories in different lenses. And so essential question that might be helpful would be, why have stories always been important throughout history? And a specific unit question that could lead to discussions about that are, why do we still read Shakespeare? Finally, even in arts, essential questions can be very valuable and can lead to overarching discussions that cross between different units and different disciplines. And we can ask, how does art reflect or change society, which relates to that conflict question that we addressed on the previous slide, but has a different focus and can view that through a different lens as well. And the specific unit question that can feed into that is, how does Impressionist art reflect life in the late 1800s? So there's a lot of examples of how unit questions can feed into and relate to essential questions, all with that goal of increasing student understanding and developing meaningful discussions so that your students can make lasting connections to the concepts that are most important and valuable for their lives. And kind of deepen that connection to the content that they're learning as well.
Yeah, so that kind of leads into the two different types of essential questions, content and process. Those content questions are, really lower lift way to drive purpose. They drive that purpose, engagement, and understanding. And they are essential in the way that they are still open-ended. They're really derived from the unit resources that you're providing. For example, if you're giving them, a bunch of Shakespeare plays, you're asking them an essential question, like we saw on the previous slide, about, being that Shakespeare is extremely powerful as history stories, and they can continue to think about stories in history, but this specific unit was on Shakespeare, so that's more content driven. And their answers are still really rooted in that they're driving inquiry, and they're going to be revisited throughout the lesson. So maybe they're used to launch the lesson, then they're used again throughout the lesson, coming back to it later on in the unit where students have changed their answers because you've given them more resources, or they've decided, this was really exciting question. I found this extremely interesting, and I went home and found a bunch of different plays from Shakespeare, and now my answer has changed. But essentially, they're still speaking about that one subject that is Shakespeare, but then when they go into the next grade, maybe they think about other stories that come up in history. And then that larger question would come from what we call as process-oriented essential questions. And it's very similar to what it sounds like. It's just really fostering lifelong learning. And so if you're thinking about like that mathematics question is more process, so it says, what do effective problem solvers do when they get stuck? I like this question a lot because not only am I a really big math person, but I think a lot of the mathematical habits of mind are really important, and they're also something that is present in every single subject. You're really teaching them this is something that I need to continue to think about, but also this is a question that I'm going to revisit because I've realized who I am as a learner. I've realized that I'm really good at problem solving when I write down all the steps to get to the answer. So in math, that may look like I write down every single step I've done in math, and that's how I solve a 3-step word problem. Versus like in life, if I have an example that I have right now, it was really hard for me to pack up my entire home. And so I was like very overwhelmed. So I'm like, how do I problem solve and get all of my packing done because my movers come tomorrow? And so the way that I went about it was I wrote down every single room and the small tasks that were in between. And that's how I problem solved. And I do find that a lot of the time, those problem solving skills that I've learned came from the essential questions that maybe a teacher might have taught me, or it came up somewhere in my life, but someone taught me how to think about those questions more effectively. There's like a couple grades that I don't remember a lot of the questions that the teachers asked me, but I do remember in 7th grade, a teacher had asked like a question that sparked a whole unit, and it was like, what makes a good friend? And I don't remember the book that we read, but I continuously return back to that question of like a good friend listens without the intent to speak. And like that to me continuously comes up in my life. And that was an essential question that sparked my interest, but also was very rooted in the process of who I think of as friends and who I think of as what makes an actual good friend. Some of the other examples that we have are what makes a book worth reading, what makes a great book, who is my audience and what's my purpose as a writer, and how do I read between the lines. I think that most of those questions there, you will feel like what makes a book worth reading. Well, last year I would have said it was crime and suspense. And this past year, it's been how do I take care of myself and create habits of a like healthy habits within your life. So like that's really a nonfiction, very fact oriented, whereas like the crime book that I read last year was very different. So just really thinking about these are questions that are relevant to the process of kind of how you think. And so we did come up with a couple resources. Some of them are just reminders of what we've already went over. But the first one is just a quick tip sheet on how to create your own essential questions. This is not an expert guide. These are just tips that I thought were helpful. They're, like I said before, it's what is not an essential question, and then what is an essential question. And then just some question stems at the bottom to kind of get you thinking about how to create questions that are not closed or factual. The other kind of resources that we've had in the last webinars, if you haven't already watched those webinars, we do have them on the Launchpad. And the read aloud guide that we went over last week already has essential questions built into them. So it's really already done for you if you feel you want to use those. And then the other kind of resource that we have is the Math in Your SmartLab webinar that we had, I don't know, a couple weeks ago. This guide for math project starters has essential questions that you could ask within it as well. So between the 3 of these resources, you have a good amount of essential questions that you could be asking. And if you've forgotten kind of how to get to these resources, you can just scan this QR code or, just log into the Launchpad, click on the welcome drop down message at the corner of the page, click on the resources, and then scroll down to other resources. And then it's under SmartLab HQ and Summer School. If you're watching this right now, you've probably already found the resources. So I think that you're good to go. But I will open up the floor to any questions. It's just Marcy, but if you have any questions, just go ahead and put them in the chat. If you're watching this later on, thank you for all of the fans that we have out there that've seen all of our other webinars. Thank you, Phil, for guest starring. It's been great. Yeah, I don't see any questions coming in from our attendees. So I will let you guys kind of send them in if you watch this later and questions come up and you've had some time to think about a lot of the information that we've seen in the last couple of webinars. Feel free to reach out to academics. Phil and I will answer as well as the rest of the academics team. So, all right, I think that's, oh, thanks, Marcy. All right, thanks guys. We'll let you go and have a great rest of your day. Bye guys.